solemnly swear that I am up to no good. Welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I am Alistair Stevens. This week in our 54th session, we focus on the closing moments of the third task of the Triwizard Tournament, then find out what awaits Harry and, to a lesser and more tragically brief extent, Cedric, on the other side of the Portkey. A tough read tonight, you guys. A tough excerpt from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, but perhaps the most important, arguably one of the most important readings that we're going to do in the entire Harry Potter series. I'm hard pushed to think of moments of more purposeful transformation for the series as a whole. This is where Harry Potter definitively is transformed from a boarding school adventure story into a young adult fantasy series. This is where things get, well, very, very real. Before we get to all of that, though, let's conclude with the Triwizard Tournament from last week. Let's conclude with the third task. As Harry and Cedric race toward the cup, they find themselves in the company of an acromantula, which they swiftly dispatch. Not terribly swiftly, actually. It's quite a pitched battle, but they do take care of business, and after the spider, the prize. "Harry!" he heard Cedric shouting. "You all right? Did it fall on you?" "No," Harry called back, panting. He looked down at his leg. It was bleeding freely. He could see some sort of thick, gluey secretion from the spider's pincers on his torn robes. He tried to get up, but his leg was shaking badly, and did not want to support his weight. He leaned against the hedge, gasping for breath, and looked around. Cedric was standing feet from the Triwizard Cup, which was gleaming behind him. "Take it, then!" Harry panted to Cedric. "Go on! Take it! You're there!" But Cedric didn't move. He merely stood there looking at Harry. Then he turned to stare at the cup. Harry saw the longing expression on his face in its golden light. Cedric looked around at Harry again, who was now holding onto the hedge to support himself. Cedric took a deep breath. "You take it. You should win. That's twice you've saved my neck in here." "That's not how it's supposed to work," Harry said. He felt angry. His leg was very painful. He was aching all over from trying to throw off the spider, and after all his efforts, Cedric had beaten him to it, just as he'd beaten Harry to ask Cho to the ball. "The one who reaches the cup first gets the points. That's you. I'm telling you, I'm not going to win any races on this leg." Cedric took a few paces nearer to the stunned spider, away from the cup, shaking his head. "No," he said. "Stop being noble," said Harry irritably. "Just take it, then we can get out of here." That last beat tells us something very important about Harry, and it's something that we skimmed over in last week's reading. When Harry is faced with the Dementor, he summons forth his happiest possible memory and uses it to fuel the Expecto Patronum charm, to drive off what he thinks at that moment is a Dementor. And his thought is getting out of here. His thought is for all of this to be over and then celebrating with Ron and Hermione. It's not just the winning of the cup, it's not just the completion of the Triwizard Tournament, it's the survival of the Triwizard Tournament. Harry here has been driven to a point of exhaustion and a point of kind of frustrated futility, I suppose, by his experiences here in the maze. He's bleeding, he's aching, he's ruined, and there's Cedric, face illuminated with golden light, ready to seize his manifest destiny as victor over the other champions of the Triwizard Tournament. He's ready to seize the cup and take home glory to Hogwarts, yes, but much more importantly, to Hufflepuff. Cedric, though, is not going to go along with this. Cedric is already having his moment of doubt, or I guess Cedric has already had his moment of doubt and is pretty staunch in his refusal. "You take it. You should win. That's twice you've saved my neck in here." "That's not how it's supposed to work," Harry said. He felt angry. His leg was very painful. He was aching all over from trying to throw off the spider, and after all his efforts, Cedric had beaten him to it, just as he'd beaten Harry to ask Cho to the ball. I mentioned last time that we actually dispense with the Cho Chang subplot in the course of this book, and we kind of have, but it's nice to see that Harry still recalls that moment. It's nice to see that Harry is still, well, attributing Cedric's success here to not superior skill. I think Harry has pretty thoroughly demonstrated an at least equal skill, if not an outright superior skill, but he's just behind. And that, too, I think echoes that adolescent experience. I think that sense that you are always trailing behind the kids who are older than you and cooler than you and more accomplished than you. They get to do things and know things and be things that you don't get to know or do or be. Harry is feeling his age in this part of the book more than I think at any other in the series. I think this, we discussed this, of course, when we were talking about his first experience of the Pensieve and being sucked into the judgment halls associated with the Ministry of Magic. He's feeling his age, he's feeling his youth, I suppose, and feeling his relative lack of experience. But he's also feeling this frustration, that he is being somehow thwarted, not thwarted by Cedric. Harry does seem to be sincere, right? Stop being noble, said Harry irritably. Just take it, then we can get out of here. Kind of echoing Ron's perspective on the conclusion of the second task, right? It's kind of echoing that idea that a foolish nobility actually serves you poorly on the field of sport/battle, right? That Harry's attachment to principle, which we're seeing here reflected out into Cedric Diggory, is an impediment to greater accomplishment, to greater achievement, which I feel like the Slytherin kids would absolutely agree with. I feel like they would be very comfortable with that perspective. But yeah, this is a different moment for Harry, a much more adult moment for Harry. He doesn't care about the glory. He doesn't care about victory. He just wants this trial to be over. And it's tempting, of course, to kind of expand this out. It's tempting to inflate this moment for Harry and to see this as Harry's most mature moment to date. But it is anchored in this physical trauma. It's anchored in the damage that has been done to his leg and this all-over ache from fighting the spider and the exhaustion of facing the third task in its entirety, of course. So I don't want to go too far down that road. I don't want to talk about Harry as a greater hero in this moment, but this is certainly a point of principle for Harry. That's not how it's supposed to work, he responds. And we've discussed over the course of the last few weeks how the rules and the structures surrounding the Triwizard Tournament have been revealed to be somewhat insubstantial, I suppose. Not narratively, structurally insubstantial, though there's certainly that too, but even within the frame of the fiction, our approach to the Triwizard Tournament has become a little flimsy. Remember Dumbledore right back at the beginning of the year saying, no one is going to know anything about the tasks. No one's going to be allowed to discuss the tasks. No one's going to be allowed to look for help. And now we're at a point where Ludo Bagman has taken them down and showed them the maze as it's being grown, instructed them that there are going to be challenges and obstacles that they're going to overcome, that Hagrid is going to supply some fantastic beasts, if you will, to kind of provide an extra challenge here. Minerva McGonagall has set aside the Transfiguration classroom for Harry and Ron and Hermione to practice all of the various charms that he's going to need for this part of the challenge, which is a kind of letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law thing from Minerva McGonagall there. Yes, technically, the charms and spells that Harry is practicing aren't exclusive to the Triwizard Tournament, right? He's not actually acting against the letter of the law in this regard, but certainly training with Ron and Hermione may be a little close to the line, at least according to the rules as they're established right back at the beginning of the year, but those rules have completely fallen aside. And what remains when the rules are set aside is principle. What remains when you are no longer bound by convention or expectation is the truth of who you are. And we see here a powerful symbol, a powerful example of who Harry really is. And it's shrouded in irritability and frustration and, yes, that sense of imminent loss, that sense of always being one step behind the older, cooler kids, all of which is very important, by the way, with specific regard to Cedric Diggory. We're going to talk about Cedric in just a couple of slides' time because, well, we've only got a couple more slides to talk about Cedric Diggory, unfortunately, but we're going to talk about him as an example of what a good person should be in the wizarding world. We'll get to all of that in just a moment. Let's continue this conversation, though, and move through to the end of the chapter. Cedric watched Harry steadying himself, holding tight to the hedge. "You told me about the dragons," Cedric said. "I would have gone down on the first task if you hadn't told me what was coming." "I had help on that too," Harry snapped, trying to mop up his bloody leg with his robes. "You helped me with the egg. We're square." I had help on the egg in the first place," said Cedric. "We're still square," said Harry, testing his leg gingerly. It shook violently as he put weight on it. He had sprained his ankle when the spider had dropped him. "You should have got more points in the second task," said Cedric mullishly. "You stayed behind to get all the hostages." "I should have done that." "I was the only one who was thick enough to take that song seriously," said Harry bitterly. "Just take the cup." "No," said Cedric. He stepped over the spider's tangled legs to join Harry, who stared at him. Cedric was serious. He was walking away from the sort of glory Hufflepuff House hadn't had in centuries. "Go on," Cedric said. He looked as though this was costing him every ounce of resolution he had, but his face was set, his arms were folded, and he seemed decided. Harry looked from Cedric to the cup. For one shining moment, he saw himself emerging from the maze holding it. He saw himself holding the Triwizard Cup aloft, heard the roar of the crowd, saw Cho's face shining with admiration, more clearly than he had ever seen it before. And then the picture faded, and he found himself staring at Cedric's shadowy, stubborn face. "Both of us," Harry said. "What?" "We'll take it at the same time. It's still a Hogwarts victory. We'll tie for it." The trading off of favors and virtues here, I suppose, is very interesting, is absolutely fascinating. It's the kind of thing that we've seen before from Cedric and Harry, right? Harry wants to give Cedric the information on the dragons in the first place because he's the only one who doesn't have it, and that offends Harry's sense of fair play and of common decency. Decency, a very important word for over the course of this reading. Then we have the egg and the kind of transactive reciprocal relationship that we saw there. Cedric paying Harry back, but also demonstrating again some of that same civility, some of that same decency. You should have got more points on the second task, said Cedric. You stayed behind to get all the hostages. I should have done that. Cedric recognizing a moment when Harry's principle actually exceeded his own, where Cedric was caught up in the letter of the law. He was caught up in the rules of the Triwizard Tournament in a way that Harry wasn't. And yes, it is because Harry took the song seriously. Yes, it's because Harry thought that the stakes were higher than they actually were, but Harry still acted from the very best of intentions given the information available to him at the time, and Cedric is finding his own performance there somewhat lacking. Go on, Cedric said. He looked as though this was costing him every ounce of resolution he had, but his face was set, his arms were folded, he seemed decided. This is not a simple decision for Cedric. For all that Cedric is held aloft as a great example of what a good wizard should be, for all that Cedric is held aloft as the paragon of Hogwarts, I suppose, this is still costing him. This is still hurting him. He is still invested, and that is absolutely necessary, because if he were not invested, then this act wouldn't count for anything. It wouldn't mean anything, or at least it wouldn't weigh the same as it does now. Seeing this interaction stirs my heart in exactly the same way as I am rarely moved to tears by tragedy, but moved to tears all the time by, particularly Tolkienian eucatastrophe, by hope and optimism and by goodness. This moves me in its way every bit as much as the beginning of the very next chapter. Both of us, Harry said. What? We'll take it at the same time. It's still a Hogwarts victory. We'll tie for it. This idea that we can set aside parts of our personal identity in service to other parts of our personal identity. In this moment, I will not be Harry Potter and you will not be Cedric Diggory. I will not be a Gryffindor and you will not be a Hufflepuff, but we will, crucially, both still be Hogwarts students. We're giving up those very definitive parts of ourselves, those parts of ourselves which have arguably been much more definitive than our identity as Hogwarts students over the course of the last 4 years, right? Harry rarely thinks of himself primarily as a Hogwarts student. He's Harry Potter first, maybe the boy who lived second, third, he's a Gryffindor. That's pretty much Harry's identity in a nutshell. And we can see, too, that he at least expects the same from Cedric, that Cedric's giving up. He was walking away from the sort of glory Hufflepuff House hadn't had in centuries. But if he really understood Cedric, if he really understood Hufflepuff, he would know that that glory just wasn't important. Why has Hufflepuff House not excelled through the years? Why has Hufflepuff House not taken home the cup at the end of every year? Why have they not accrued more house points than every other house combined, or at least an equal measure of house points? It's not necessarily about valor, and it's not necessarily about heroism. It's not about exceptionalism in that sense, particularly if we lean into the more modern, later Harry Potter book idea that the Sorting Hat is a little more malleable and a little more mutable in its approach to individual students. It's not about an absence of skill or of power or of potential. It seems to me that the Hufflepuffs just care about other things more. They are less inclined to compete when they can collaborate. They are less inclined to contest when they can be decent, when they can form relationships. And that is a very powerful insight into what Hufflepuff stands for, and certainly what Cedric Diggory stands for here. Must Be a Weasley says, love the coming together for a Hogwarts victory, but I wish in this book there was more cohesion with the students from other schools. Did the tourney accomplish its goal of bringing the wizarding world together in friendly competition, or did it do the opposite? Yeah, that's a really great question. The stated goal of the Triwizard Tournament to foster closer relationships between the three greatest wizarding schools in Europe. Are we feeling more close to Durmstrang and Beauxbaton than we otherwise would? Well, right now we're feeling pretty close to Beauxbaton, right? Between the kind of paradoxical controversy about Madame Maxime and then Harry's personal, albeit somewhat distant relationship with Fleur, I think that we have softened Fleur, and by extension Beauxbaton, to the point where actually, yes, we are a little closer to Beauxbaton than we were And I feel as though we were almost there with Durmstrang too. I mean, Karkaroff is a prickly figure. Karkaroff is difficult to reconcile with that stated intent. But there is ultimately at the heart of Harry Potter an appreciation for the virtues of collaboration. People don't succeed when they are alone. We're going to get a stark reminder of this, in fact, as we move into the other chapters of tonight's reading, and we see Voldemort gather his Death Eaters around him. We see his relationship with Wormtail. We see his rulership style, I suppose. What we do in the rest of the Harry Potter book, though, is focus on friendship. We focus on community. We focus on a collaborative response to the challenges that we face. We do that, of course, in the presence and in the body, the tripartite body of our power trio, but we also do it more generally. We do it with this notion of the House Cup and the idea of the houses of Hogwarts. If we strip out all of the kind of moral judgments that are placed upon one's association with a particular house, or the judgment of virtue and value that are associated with the identity of each individual student as belonging to an individual house at Hogwarts. If we strip all of that out and we just look at it as raw tribalism, when you show up at Hogwarts, the sorting hat says A, B, C, or D, and it really doesn't matter which one you get, right? Or four different, I don't know, fruits or animals or whatever. It doesn't matter what your identity is. What matters is that you have that identity. It's a kind of tribalism. That is the commonplace kind of mechanism that we associate with houses in schools, which is not, I know, a terribly common thing here in the United States, but is actually still pretty common back in the United Kingdom. Certainly when I was in high school, I moved around a lot as a kid, so I have a pretty broad experience of different high schools, but 2 of the 3 high schools that I attended over the course of my senior years were actually possessed of some kind of house structure, and it never mattered as much as the houses of Hogwarts. Of course, it was never as elemental or as definitive or as attuned to one's identity, both external and internal, as it is at Hogwarts, but it is still powerful. It is still something, I suppose. So all of these questions of identity are now being set aside, and we are unifying Harry and Cedric, well, in 2 ways. As Hogwarts kids, of course, it's still a Hogwarts victory, we'll tie for it, but also as champions. They are setting aside the contest in order to collaborate, which is perhaps the most Hogwartsian thing that they could possibly do at this point. Yeah. Let me see here. Wilhelm Scream saying, Rowling could have written this in such a way that all 3 schools are required to work together to win, but then, of course, the end of this particular tournament, there would unfortunately be more spares. Yes, I mean, that is something. Looking at not the shape of this story in and of itself. The shape of this story, if you strip out the structural problems and the fact that, as I've said before, the Triwizard Tournament structurally is kind of insufficient for a book of this length and this ambition, which is why we get repeatedly bogged down in grinding subplots that don't really go anywhere, and why the plot demands that Harry just forget about the Triwizard Tournament until it's the most important and all-consuming thing in his life, right? If you strip out that structural argument and you look at what the story is accomplishing, the themes and the thrust of the story, yes, it is odd that J.K. Rowling didn't lean more on that idea of collaboration and cooperation. It's odd that in this moment, right at the end of the 3rd task, we actually invert our understanding of Victor Crumb, right? We've been taking exactly that line. We have been growing closer to Fleur. We've been growing closer to Victor. We've been normalizing the experience of both the Beauxbatons and the Durmstrang kids. We've been integrating the experience of those 2 schools into our understanding of Hogwarts. We've been seeing that actually kids are kids with a few problems and a few gaps and a few inconsistencies, certainly, but we have, it seems, been going some distance toward that. Did that most recently, of course, with the meeting of the parents, where we see that actually, yeah, kids are just kids, and the champions are all just teenagers. They're all just doing their best in this very difficult space, and they want their parents to be proud of them. And that's kind of a universal experience for the children in the frame of the Triwizard Tournament, I suppose. But then we invert that. Then we twist that horribly with Victor betraying Cedric, arguably, and of course, we're going to circle back around to that in a couple of chapters' time. We're going to talk a little about what really happened out there. But right now, we've, yes, taken some steps toward that integration, but as I said last time, we've also done that classic Harry Potter turn of, oh no, the guy we thought was a good guy was actually a bad guy, or the guy that we were becoming close to, the guy that we started to like, is actually a bad guy. He just wanted to put his own personal ambition above the good of the community and the good of these people that he has kind of, sort of become friendly with, right? That's a classic Harry Potter turn. We see turns very similar to that at the end of Philosopher's Stone, at the end of Chamber of Secrets, at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, and now here again at the end of Goblet of Fire, except of course that isn't the end of Goblet of Fire. That is not the point of this story, but Rowling is seeking to explore and to replicate and ultimately to violently subvert our expectations here, given the structure and the shape of the last 3 Harry Potter novels. Yeah, I mean, there is some inconsistency there, but it's a kind of deliberate textual inconsistency, I think, that plays into this idea that Rowling wants what happens next to be a sucker punch and is, I think, very successful in her execution of that, but also is honoring and reflecting our experience of Harry Potter up to this point. I think that's a really purposeful bit of structuring there. Yeah, let's catch up. Good, I think we're up to date here. That's fine. All right, let's move into then chapter 32, Flesh, Blood, and Bone. The boys seize the Triwizard Cup and are immediately tugged. They are immediately transported by it to the graveyard. Harry felt his feet slam into the ground. His injured leg gave way and he fell forward. His hand let go of the Triwizard Cup at last. He raised his head. "Where are we?" he said. Cedric shook his head. He got up, pulled Harry to his feet, and they looked around. They had left the Hogwarts grounds completely. They had obviously travelled miles, perhaps hundreds of miles, for even the mountains surrounding the castle were gone. They were standing instead in a dark and overgrown graveyard. The black outline of a small church was visible beyond a large yew tree to their right. A hill rose above them to their left. Harry could just make out the outline of a fine old house on the hillside. Cedric looked down at the Triwizard Cup and then up at Harry. "Did anyone tell you the cup was a portkey?" he asked. "Nope," said Harry. He was looking around the graveyard. It was completely silent and slightly eerie. "Is this supposed to be part of the task?" "I don't know," said Cedric. He sounded slightly nervous. "Wands out, do you reckon?" "Yeah," said Harry, glad that Cedric had made the suggestion rather than him. They pulled out their wands. Harry kept looking around him. He had yet again the strange feeling that they were being watched. "Someone's coming," he said suddenly. Squinting tensely through the darkness, they watched the figure drawing nearer, walking steadily toward them between the graves. Harry couldn't make out a face, but from the way it was walking and holding its arms, he could tell that it was carrying something. Whoever it was, he was short and wearing a hooded cloak pulled up over his head to obscure his face, and several paces nearer, the gap between them closing all the time, Harry saw that the thing in the person's arms looked like a baby. Or was it merely a bundle of robes? Things are about to get really bad. Things are about to get really dark. Little Hangleton, wherein we find this graveyard, is in Yorkshire. So we have traveled, as close as we can be with the geography, certainly a distance of hundreds of miles, something like 300 miles probably from Hogwarts to Yorkshire. We're a good distance from where we were. I want to take just a moment, though, to talk about how beautifully structured the portkey element, the portkey function of this plot is. It is introduced effortlessly back at the beginning of the book. It is introduced by the time we've built out the structure to explain why we are traveling by anonymous portkey to the Quidditch World Cup, of course, but it is introduced beautifully. It is introduced with a remarkably deft touch, and it does exactly what it is supposed to do. That is to say that at no point reading this book are you left with the feeling that the portkey is an unresolved idea or that it has more potential application just waiting to show up on the page. The portkey is introduced, it is used, it is resolved, it is set aside. That's a powerful bit of narrative work here. That's a powerful bit of world building by J.K. Rowling, because it could easily have been so much more intrusive. It could have been so much more heavy-handed, and it just isn't. And the temptation to reference the portkey when we're discussing people traveling to and vanishing from the Hogwarts school grounds, right? We've had this repeated beat from Hermione over the course of the last few chapters. "You can't disapparate on the school grounds," she says over and over and over, getting more and more italicized as she says it. We're holding off from the portkey, though. We don't want to bring that back to the reader's conscious mind. We're happy with it right there in the subconscious, so that the turn when it comes, well, is perfect. Narratively, this is Just gorgeous, of course. Everything about the conclusion of the Triwizard Tournament tells us that we're approaching the end of the story. The seizing of the cup should be followed up by next chapter. Harry and Cedric walked out of the maze together, holding the cup aloft, and the cheers were rapturous, and the wand light was golden and glorious, and everyone was happy, and they all lived happily ever after the end, right? Everything about the third task is priming us for that response exactly, but the portkey gives us a narrative disassociation, a narrative dissonance in exactly the same way as it gives us a spatial disassociation. We are transported not just from the grounds of Hogwarts to Little Hangleton, but we are transported from one story into another. And more importantly, we are transported from the climax, the joyous resolution of one story, into the third act of the other. We are now completely diverged from where we thought we were and where we thought that we were going. Though Harry and Cedric are, if anything, more united than ever. I love their camaraderie here. Did anyone tell you the cup was a portkey? Nope. Is this supposed to be part of the task? I don't know. One's out, do you reckon? Yep. Like, that exchange is really strong and really intimate in this moment. They're not blaming each other. They're not turning on each other. They are unified in this moment where they are facing, for the first time in the third task, something that is genuinely unexpected, right? The framing of the third task was such that, well, okay, let's go back. The framing of the first task was completely opaque. We had no idea what we were going to face in the first task, except for the intervention of Mad-Eye Moody and Hagrid, and then Harry's sense of decency. We had some vague sense of what we were going to face in the second task, thanks to the clue in the egg. We had a pretty good idea of what we were going to face in the third task, thanks to Ludo Bagman and the kind of possibility space of being a wizard in the wizarding world. Oh, we're going to face obstacles and overcome them with magic? Well, cool. That's literally what we go to school for. That is literally why we are here. But now we are in a very different world, and we do not know what to expect. And that sense of sudden cold and sudden distance, obviously the symbolism of the graveyard is very powerful, a functional bit of narrative building too, not just symbolic in its application, but also functional, as we'll see in just a few pages' time. And the church, the dark and overgrown graveyard, the black outline of a small church was visible beyond a large yew tree to their right. The kind of pagan and occult significance of the yew tree standing out there. A hill rose above them to their left. Harry could just make out the outline of a fine old house on the hillside. I wonder which house that could be. Yeah, we're in a different world. We're in a different story. Wilhelm Scream asks, are we to think that the cup being a portkey was actually planned by Fudge, etc., and was supposed to transport the winners to a celebration, but that it has been hacked by Moody et al.? You know what? We'll look at that when we get to the final. Well, okay, we'll look at that when we get to the final description of all that is going on, because yeah, we're going to spend some time after the climax is over unraveling all of these various plots. But yes, we'll get to that. We'll begin that at least in next week's reading. But yeah, that is a very interesting question. That does seem to be appropriate, right? It doesn't seem to be completely impossible that seizing the Triwizard Cup at the end would transport the winner victorious to a plinth, to a dais, to a celebratory, enclave where we can festoon them with confetti and offer them, I was going to say champagne, but probably butterbeer would be more appropriate, right? In this instance, I think, yes, I could buy that possibility space, but we'll look more carefully at that as we get to it. Yeah. Okay, let's take a look then. Here it is, you guys. Cedric Diggory. Harry lowered his wand slightly and glanced sideways at Cedric. Cedric shot him a quizzical look. They both turned back to watch the approaching figure. It stopped beside a towering marble headstone only 6 feet from them. For a second, Harry and Cedric and the short figure simply looked at one another. And then, without warning, Harry's scar exploded with pain. It was agony such as he had never felt in all his life. His wand slipped from his fingers as he put his hands over his face. His knees buckled. He was on the ground and he could see nothing at all. His head was about to split open. From far away above his head, he heard a high, cold voice say, "Kill the spare!" A swishing noise, and a second voice, who screeched the words to the night, "Avada Kedavra!" A blast of green light blazed through Harry's eyelids, and he heard something heavy fall to the ground beside him. The pain in his scar reached such a pitch that he retched, and then it diminished. Terrified of what he was about to see, he opened his stinging eyes. Cedric was lying spread-eagled on the ground beside him. He was dead. For a second that contained an eternity, Harry stared into Cedric's face, at his open, grey eyes, blank and expressionless as the windows of a deserted house, at his half-open mouth, which looked slightly surprised. And then, before Harry's mind had accepted what he was seeing, before he could feel anything but numb disbelief, he felt himself being pulled to his feet. The short man in the cloak had put down his bundle, lit his wand, and was dragging Harry toward the marble headstone. Harry saw the name upon it flickering in the wand light before he was forced around and slammed against it. Tom Riddle. So, the death of Cedric Diggory. Let's talk first, of course, about the application of Avada Kedavra, the killing curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses. We have really been leaning on the unforgivable curses after their introduction part of the way through this book. This is enormously powerful, enormously sudden, and, of course, it's hard to think of a way in which we could kill Cedric Diggory that would be, more morally ambiguous, I suppose, a way that we could lean into it such that we might preserve a need of explanation later, but the use of the unforgivable curse here seals the deal. This is an act of raw and naked evil and malevolence. Kill the Spare, of course, is, so punchy and heartbreaking and brutal in its simplicity. There's no elegance to it. It is simply necessary. It is simply the taking care of an overlooked detail in one's plot. We cannot be impeded by the presence of Cedric Diggory, so kill the Spare. The Spare. Associating Harry and Cedric all the more closely, right? Because the idea of a spare here, I think, does speak to the notion of Harry and Cedric both being exemplars of a kind of, I suppose, what we might think of as Hogwarts heroism. I'm having some trouble unpicking heroism and goodness in the world of Harry Potter. I actually had a really interesting email exchange with a listener this week about goodness in the wizarding world. And the question was asked, hey, are wizards good? Is the wizarding world a good place? Are we supposed to like it? And the answer is pretty clear, I think, by the time that we get to Goblet of Fire and even in Prisoner of Azkaban. No, I don't think the wizarding world is a good place. Even in Prisoner of Azkaban, where we're talking about rampant injustice and we're talking about lies and deception and we're talking about the long and deep shadows that have previously and may again fall over the wizarding world, it seems dangerous. It seems preoccupied with appearances and with facades and with superficiality, I suppose. Then we're dealing with, the tension between pure bloods and impure bloods. We're dealing with all of the power structures that we've discussed. I can't go back through everything that we discussed in the context of Prisoner of Azkaban or a Goblet of Fire. Come to that. Then by the time we get to Goblet of Fire and we're talking about the Quidditch World Cup and we're talking about the Triwizard Tournament and we're talking about bread and circuses and we're talking about the House Elf storyline, the House Elf subplot, and we're talking about, Sirius giving us the rundown on Barty Crouch Sr. and the whole the demonstration, I suppose, via pensive of his abuses of power. No, I don't think the wizarding world is a good place. I think that Hogwarts is a good place. I think that we as readers are supposed to be connected to Hogwarts as something of a sanctuary, something of a beacon, something of a city on the hill, not an uncomplicated beacon, not an uncomplicated symbol of what can be good about the wizarding world, because, well, we still have Malfoy, and we still have Crabbe and Goyle, and we still have Snape, and we still have, there are so many elements to Hogwarts which are dangerous and challenging in our understanding of the wizarding world in the first place, but that doesn't matter, because the anchor point for Hogwarts is Albus Dumbledore, who is, at this point, for all that we know, there may be some extra material later, but for all that we know at this point, Albus Dumbledore is perhaps the most purely good wizard in the wizarding world. He's not possessed of, Snape's self-serving duplicity and outright cruelty. He's not possessed of Gilderoy Lockhart's preoccupation with fame and celebrity. He's not even possessed of Hagrid's kind of harmless, stumbling naivete, I suppose, which we could also kind of question a little bit. Like, is that a good thing? Is that a capital G good thing? Can we follow the Kantian categorical imperative and will that everyone in the world behave like Rubius Hagrid behaves? Well, God, no, because society would falter in a matter of days. He's not even as waspish as Minerva McGonagall is. Minerva McGonagall absolutely represents the good of Hogwarts at her heart, at her core, but her pursuit of that good is more sharp-edged than Albus Dumbledore's is. Dumbledore stands completely apart, but because he is the headmaster of Hogwarts, he creates around him a space for goodness. And I'm talking about goodness because that is very important to our understanding of Harry and Cedric as this reflected pair. I don't think that it is stating the case too boldly at this point to suppose that in a way Harry might have, will grow up to be Cedric Diggory. That the two are occupying different points on the same continuum, right? What separates Harry and Cedric? Well, a confidence, a certain sense of one's place in the world, a certain ability to engage with one's emotions more honestly and more directly. Certainly Cedric seems to have the leg up in that regard, but Cedric is also 3 years older, so of course he does. That's not a difference between two different people. That's a difference between the same person at two different points in his life. Cedric is decent and civil and generous and friendly and given to collaboration in exactly the same way as Harry is at his best. Harry is still a little more complicated than that, but again, partly to do with his age here. Yeah, and okay, well, yeah, a few of you in the chat here are already looking past the question of goodness and the notion of the spare, the suggestion that to some extent Harry and Cedric are coexistent, at least in intent, if not in actual significance, at least in worth and in value, if not in actual significance. But of course, that's not the important thing that happens on this page. Cedric Diggory is dead. And this is stark and it is shocking. And you'll see the way that the prose here just collapses right down into that final point, into that heartbreaking 3-word sentence that we get. Look at what J.K. Rowling is doing earlier in this passage. And then without warning, Harry's scar exploded with pain. It was agony such as he had never felt in all his life, semicolon. His wand slipped from his fingers as he put his hands over his face, semicolon. His knees buckled, semicolon. He was on the ground and he could see nothing at all, semicolon. His head was about to split open. We're getting this complex and immediate, this paratactical structure, right, which I've been discussing a lot over in the recent sessions of There and Back Again, as we discussed the end of Book 5 of The Lord of the Rings. We get paratactical structure. That is to say that none of these details is subordinated to the previous detail. Instead, they are all they're not obviously happening at once, but we are given the sense that they are happening at once. We're getting this rush of sensory information, and our sentence construction is therefore more complex and complicated. But by the time we get right down to it, a blast of green light blazed through Harry's eyelids, and he heard something heavy fall to the ground beside him. Semicolon. The pain in his scar reached such a pitch that he retched, and then it diminished. Semicolon. Terrified of what he was about to see, he opened his stinging eyes. Cedric was lying spread-eagled on the ground beside him. Period. He was dead. Period. That's it. We strip away all narrative artifice from the prose here, or we strip away that self-conscious syntactical artifice, I suppose, from the prose. What is left is nothing but the naked entryway into the emotional heart of the story. I've talked about this previously, and this is kind of expanding the idea of why these different prose constructions are so important. There are two elements in any story. There is the story and the medium by which that story is delivered to you. And I've kind of talked about this in the past as being somewhat roughly equivalent to doors and landscapes, right? If you imagine that you have at the bottom of your garden this immense stone wall, it's 12 feet high, it's 14 feet high, it's 25 feet high, it doesn't matter. It is high enough that you have never seen past it. And there is set in this garden wall a door. And beyond that door, there is the landscape of story. And your garden is your real life, and the landscape beyond is narrative, and the door is the means of entry into it. And some writers will spend their lifetimes crafting gorgeous, intricate, constructed doors. Some writers are interested in the beauty of the thing. They're interested in artifice and in craft in that sense. And some writers don't care at all. Some writers have a flimsy IKEA door standing there because their interest is in the landscape on the other side. And those are two different things. That is one of the things it's one of the metaphors that we can use to distill out an understanding of genre fiction, an understanding of storytelling, and literature. Literature is not primarily concerned with storytelling. It's not primarily concerned with the landscape beyond the door. It's primarily concerned with art. It's primarily concerned with the door itself. The door can be intricately carved and beautiful to behold, and you can spend hours there staring at it as you would a great painting, right? That is the purpose of really high art. That is the purpose of literature. Stories don't care about the door. And a particularly complicated door, particularly a door that can be locked and bound or opened only by careful study and the application of years of knowledge and experience, right? I'm thinking of, Ulysses, for example, or the works of David Foster Wallace, or House of Leaves, for crying out loud, right? A door that requires a great deal of study to open is perforce going to stop you, or at least inhibit you in your exploration of the landscape beyond. There can be a negative tension between doors and landscapes, between prose and story, and there can also be a positive tension between doors and landscapes, between prose and story. And here what we're doing is stripping out the door completely. He was dead, period. For that moment, the door between us and the fictional landscape on the other side just swings wide open. There is no impediment between those two things at all, between our experience of the thing at all. There's nothing delineating our real world response to the book and the fictional world response to the book, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Why does Cedric die? Cedric dies for a couple of different reasons. The most important is that it marks this hard, fast tonal shift. Anyone can die. Even beloved characters, and I think it's pretty fair to say that at this point in the book, Cedric Diggory is a fairly beloved character, right? Even if we were on Harry's side during the whole Cho subplot debacle, we have kind of come around on Cedric in exactly the same way as Harry has come around on Cedric. Cedric is a good guy, and now he's dead. We are willing not just to punish evildoers, not just to punish those people who have crossed certain lines in their past and for whom redemption is an incomplete and elusive thing. We're just willing to kill heroes. Flat out. There it is. Sudden, harsh. Death can be sudden. Death can be not a challenge that you face or an obstacle that you fail to overcome. Death can just be a thing that happens to you, and it can happen to you anytime, any place. It can come out of literally nowhere, as it does here. And the other thing that we accomplish through the death of Cedric Diggory is reframing our understanding of Voldemort as readers. And crucially, I think Harry's understanding of Voldemort. There's a reason that Cedric's death is going to weigh so heavily on Harry as he moves through the rest of his, life, right? Ultimately, I don't really want to get into the details of extra-textual and quasi-canonical material, I suppose. But Cedric Diggory's death is going to be a really important turning point for the entire wizarding world. But what it accomplishes in the here and now is reframing our understanding of Voldemort. Voldemort has killed, to the best of our knowledge, to the limits of our personal experience, one, maybe two people in the entire Harry Potter series so far that we have witnessed in the here and now, not in flashback, not by, severe and troubled accounts by Dumbledore or by Sirius or by whomever, right? Voldemort has killed two people, arguably two people. He has definitely killed Frank Bryce. We saw that right at the beginning of this book. He has definitely killed Frank Bryce, and Frank Bryce was a guy we didn't care about. He's also indirectly responsible. He's kind of indirectly and directly responsible for the death of Professor Quirrell back in Philosopher's Stone. Of course, now I'm kind of hedging that because we still don't, at this point here at the end of the fourth book, we still don't completely understand the mechanism by which that death occurred, but occur it did. This is dragging Voldemort into the here and the now. This is anchoring Voldemort in Harry's personal experience. This is what happens. Death comes for anyone, it comes without warning, and it comes now. This is present, despite all the shadows surrounding him, all the fear that has surrounded his name, whether it is uttered or not. Voldemort has been a power in absentia throughout most, if not all, of the Harry Potter series, and now we're seeing that power manifest. This is, present danger. Must Be a Weasley observes the first innocent person that we witnessed die in the books. That's an interesting question. What do we think of Frank Bryce? Do we think that Frank Bryce was not an innocent person? I mean, he was kind of taking a paycheck, I suppose, but and we certainly don't witness it directly. But I'm being a little facetious. Must Be a Weasley. But yes, this is so stark. And you're right, I think, calling out Cedric's innocence there. It's not just about goodness. It is about innocence. And I've been thinking about this a lot in our discussion of Dumbledore's use of the pensive, actually, and talking about Dumbledore finding himself mentally and cognitively overwhelmed And as he's kind of acknowledging that, well, Harry too must have experienced that, and Harry's like, well, no, actually, I mean, I will a chapter from now, but I haven't yet, thanks so much. We talked last time about the ways in which that is more often a feature of the adolescent mind, that the adolescent mind is more likely to be overwhelmed than the adult mind, because part of being an adult is learning to compartmentalize and learning to, you know, shut down the things that you can't think about right now in order to focus on the things that you have to think about right now. And Dumbledore doesn't seem to quite be in that space. Does Minerva McGonagall have a pensive? Would Minerva McGonagall use a pensive? Would Professor Flitwick use a pensive? I don't think so. I don't think that they occupy that same space. Minerva McGonagall has that adult clarity that I think we can argue, and this is one of the distinctions, one of the points of distinctions here, points of distinction, I should say, between McGonagall and Dumbledore, is that Minerva McGonagall has clarity and Dumbledore has a valuable and admirable ambiguity. He's not concerned with clear lines of conflict and fact and actuality in quite the same way. Yeah. Okay, let's... Erica's saying Frank Bryce was definitely innocent, but in a different way than Cedric. Yes, exactly right. Yes. Sorry, just scrolled. I want to come back to the rest of your comment there, Erica. Cedric has a childlike innocence, but Frank is innocent in terms that he wasn't connected at all to the wizarding world and was just doing his job. Yes. Yes, Erica, I completely agree. I would kind of raise the open question, therefore, are all muggles innocent in that childlike way? Are all muggles, from the point of view of Goblet of Fire, not even Prisoner, though, as I've said before, I think that's where we start to see the turn, are all muggles innocent? Because isn't innocence and naivete kind of connected to a lack of knowledge and a lack of experience? And muggles necessarily can't experience the wizarding world, so aren't they also kind of... Isn't their maturity, their sophistication, their knowledgeable empowerment kind of held in abeyance by this shroud of secrecy, by the masquerade of the wizarding world? That's a thought I'm going to be puzzling over in the course of the next week. Yeah, it must be obviously pointing out, but we don't see Frank die. So no, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely fair. Yes. Okay, good. All right. Let's, exactly, Sailor Melissa pointing out that the death of Frank was intellectual in the same way that Albus read about it in the newspaper. I think that's actually very, very good. Yeah, must be Weasley pointing out Minerva doesn't need a pensive. Minerva never forgets. Yes, I think that's, yeah, she is a pensive, I'm sure. Yes. All right, good. Let's, okay. Rahit has a really interesting point here too. I mean, Rahit says, I hate to victim blame, but maybe part of the reason Cedric's death is more shocking than Frank's, other than we know Cedric personally, is that Frank did willingly go into the house, while of course not knowing what would happen. Cedric ended up here completely unintentionally, is killed before he knows anything that's going on, and that's just more jarring. I do think that's actually a powerful distinction. You're right. Though again, I think that connects us back to this question of, to what degree can we credit muggles with real agency when their knowledge of the world is so willfully incomplete, right? Frank didn't know what was going on because he had no way of knowing what was going on. And that's not just inexperience and naivete in that sense. It's not just that he is lacking worldliness as a positive quality and characteristic. It's that he is being denied that knowledge by the masquerade that is being perpetrated by the wizarding world against the muggles, right? This is all part, and this is one of the reasons that I've been leaning so hard on these points of transition, as we're encouraged to see the muggle world in the first two books as being the dominant culture, and wizards are hiding and reclusive, to partway through Azkaban, well, even beginning of Azkaban, right? We can think about the whole inflation episode right at the beginning of Azkaban and talk about, yeah, the ways in which actually the wizarding world is the dominant culture. The wizarding world is the dominant society, and the muggle world is preserved. The muggle world is secluded and sequestered. Yeah, I think talking about Frank Bryce's agency in that space where he is denied pertinent knowledge, if Frank had known, actually wizards are a thing, and actually evil wizards are a thing, and actually spells are a thing. So just have that information, just do as you will, but have that information, then we would think very differently about his decision to go up to the house, of course, and to investigate more freely, and certainly to question what he sees. Yeah. Good. Okay, let's move on. Oh, I also wanted to talk a little about okay, we've spent forever on this slide. One more brief beat here, because it is going to be important later and has already been important, picking up on what we were discussing last time, this evocative phrase that Dumbledore uses when he's talking about the connection between Harry and Voldemort, the curse that failed, right? inverting our understanding of what distinguishes Harry Potter, that Harry is special, that he's the boy who lived, that he's the boy who cast down Voldemort, into, well, no, the curse is what failed. Voldemort failed more than you succeeded. Rebalancing that is crucial and is, I think, highlighted here by our close comparison of Harry and Cedric and the fact that Cedric is the spare. The two are not equal. The two are not the same because Harry is necessary to what happens next and Cedric is absolutely not. Let's bear that in mind as we move forward. So we get to the preparing of the spell that has brought us here to the graveyard in Little Hangleton. The liquid in the cauldron seemed to heat very fast. The surface began not only to bubble, but to send out fiery sparks as though it were on fire. Steam was thickening, blurring the outline of Wormtail tending the fire. The movements beneath the robes became more agitated, and Harry heard the high, cold voice again. Harry! The whole surface of the water was alight with sparks now. It might have been encrusted with diamonds. It's ready, master! Now! Said the cold voice. Wormtail pulled open the robes on the ground, revealing what was inside them, and Harry let out a yell that was strangled in the wad of material blocking his mouth. It was as though Wormtail had flipped over a stone and revealed something ugly, slimy, and blind, but worse, 100 times worse. The thing Wormtail had been carrying had the shape of a crouched human child, except that Harry had never seen anything less like a child. It was hairless and scaly-looking, a dark, raw, reddish black. Its arms and legs were thin and feeble, and its face, no child alive ever had a face like that, flat and snake-like with gleaming red eyes. The thing seemed almost helpless. It raised its thin arms, put them around Wormtail's neck, and Wormtail lifted it. As he did so, his hood fell back, and Harry saw the look of revulsion on Wormtail's weak, pale face in the firelight as he carried the creature to the rim of the cauldron. For one moment, Harry saw the evil, flat face illuminated and the sparks dancing on the surface of the potion. And then Wormtail lowered the creature into the cauldron. There was a hiss, and it vanished below the surface. Harry heard its frail body hit the bottom with a soft thud. This is one of the most horrific things that J.K. Rowling has ever written. This is genuinely disturbing, genuinely disquieting, and takes a really interesting turn toward the Lovecraftian, I suppose, right? The thing Wormtail had been carrying had the shape of a crouched human child, except that Harry had never seen anything less like a child. So it was exactly the shape of a child, but also nothing at all like a child. It was hairless and scaly looking, a dark, raw, reddish black. It was inexpressively ugly. It was incalculably horrible. It was a cosmic level grotesque that Harry can't quite encapsulate. And the tension here is, as he struggles to describe it, it was hairless and scaly looking, a dark, raw, reddish black. I don't think that I can visualize that color, but I can absolutely visualize what it is that Harry is describing here. What does a raw, reddish black look like? Raw and reddish, okay, we're thinking of meat and we're thinking of blood and we're thinking of, human viscera, perhaps. Raw and reddish, okay, but a dark, raw, reddish black, a dark black, if nothing else, is a weird opposition here. What is it that Harry is trying to express? Well, it is something unknowable. It is something ineffable. It is something that is communicated to us through the metaphor and not the actual literal prose here. It's very, very creepy here. So this is the preparation. Okay, another minor little nerdy beat for me here. And Harry heard the high, cold voice again. Harry! Hurry, sounding a lot like Harry there, I think. It depends on your reading of Voldemort's voice. It depends on how deeply that voice has kind of penetrated your subconscious as you're reading it, how fully that voice is represented in your internal monologue as you are reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. But for me, those two are very, very close. Harry heard the high, cold voice again. Harry! It feels close enough. The whole surface of the water was alight with sparks now. It might have been encrusted with diamonds. This use of light and of things associated with positive magic in the Harry Potter universe here perverted in the blackest, oldest possible way. Wormtail, of course, revealing this ugly, scaly, flat and snake-like faced child, and then immersing it in the potion in the cauldron. We're going to skip right ahead to bone, flesh, and blood here. Bone of the father unknowingly given, you will renew your son! The surface of the grave at Harry's feet cracked. Horrified, Harry watched as a fine trickle of dust rose into the air at Wormtail's command and fell softly into the cauldron. The diamond surface of the water broke and hissed. It sent sparks in all directions and turned a vivid, poisonous-looking blue. And now Wormtail was whimpering. He pulled a long, thin, shining silver dagger from inside his cloak. His voice broke into petrified sobs. "Flesh of the servant, willingly given, you will revive your master." He stretched his right hand out in front of him, the hand with the missing finger. He gripped the dagger very tightly in his left hand and swung it upward. Harry realized what Wormtail was about to do a second before it happened. He closed his eyes as tightly as he could, but he could not block the scream that pierced the night, that went through Harry as though he had been stabbed with the dagger too. He heard something fall to the ground, heard Wormtail's anguished panting, then a sickening splash as something was dropped into the cauldron. Harry couldn't stand to look, but the potion had turned a burning red. The light of it shone through Harry's closed eyelids. Wormtail was gasping and moaning with agony. Not until Harry felt Wormtail's anguished breath on his face did he realize that Wormtail was right in front of him. "Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. You will resurrect your foe." Harry could do nothing to prevent it. He was tied too tightly. Squinting down, struggling hopelessly at the ropes binding him, he saw the shining silver dagger shaking in Wormtail's remaining hand. He felt its point penetrate the crook of his right arm and blood seeping down into the sleeve of his torn robes. Wormtail, still panting with pain, fumbled in his pocket for a glass vial and held it to Harry's cut, so that a dribble of blood fell into it. So a couple of things. We'll talk about the specifics of the spell in just a moment. But what we have here most powerfully, yes, as Must Be a Weasley is calling out here in the chat, this whole time Harry can't even move. We have deprived Harry of his agency in this moment. We've deprived Harry of his agency pretty thoroughly through this chapter. Why is he so incapacitated by the pain of his scar when Voldemort first appears? Well, okay, narratively, because Voldemort is nearby, and as Albus Dumbledore predicted in the last reading, when Voldemort feels that extra potent surge of hate for Harry, the pain intensifies, but Harry is incapacitated while Cedric is killed because we cannot allow there to be any question of Harry's culpability in Cedric's death. We need, narratively, for Harry to be completely guiltless in the death of Cedric Diggory. We can't, some people will, but we can't, at this point in the narrative, start to build a response that says, well, why didn't Harry just do something? He had his wand. Why didn't he just cast a spell? Why didn't he just attack Wormtail? Why didn't he just try and dash the burden that Wormtail was carrying against the rocks of the gravestones? Why didn't he do something? Well, we've incapacitated him thoroughly, utterly in that moment. And now we've done so again by tying him to the gravestone. He just can't act. Harry could do nothing to prevent it. He was tied too tightly. He can't move. He can't respond. We are removing Harry's agency from him. Harry's agency, of course, the most important thing about Harry Potter. We are removing his agency from him, partly for narrative reasons, partly so that we can get the following chapter and we can have all of this exposition while Harry is basically transparent to the narrative voice. Harry does very little in the next chapter. He's doing very little in this chapter because he is so ruthlessly incarcerated, and also so that we, the readers, are not left with questions. Why doesn't he take some kind of action? Why doesn't he do something? He's not just, if you'll forgive the, borrowing a name that has more significance in Harry Potter than it does in basically any other realm of the English language, but he hasn't been stupefied. He's been literally bound and cannot take action. That's all so important. Yeah. So we have the offering: bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. Does anyone notice anything weird about that? Anyone notice anything weird about that construction? This chapter is called Flesh, Blood, and Bone, and yet when we get right to it, bone, flesh, and blood. Which, the only reason that I'm highlighting that at all, of course, is that it generates an interesting tension because it implies a greater purpose in what J.K. Rowling is trying to do, I suppose. It implies a greater purpose in the construction that we get in the spell, because flesh, blood, and flesh, blood, and bone is more poetically satisfying, more poetically gratifying, I suppose. But bone, flesh, and blood, this is more narratively gratifying. This is more metaphorically gratifying. It's more significant in the course of this to move from bone, which was living and is no longer living, to flesh, to the chamber of life, to blood, the mechanism of life. We are getting more intimate. We are getting closer and closer to this thing. We start off with the trickle of dust. A fine trickle of dust rose into the air at Wormtail's command and fell softly into the cauldron, which, by the way, way creepier, way more powerful for me than the actual bone that we use in the movie adaptation of Goblet of Fire here. But yes, the fine trickle of dust rose into the air at Wormtail's command and fell softly into the cauldron. Then we get the unspeakable sound of the hand, the severed hand being dropped into the cauldron, and then the blood being poured into the cauldron, I suppose. That intimacy is replicated too here with Wormtail's presence. Not until Harry felt Wormtail's anguished breath on his face did he realize that Wormtail was right in front of him. Wormtail is, this close before Harry even realizes that he's there. Look too at Wormtail's speech patterns in the 3 bits of attributed dialogue that we get here. Bone of the father unknowingly given, you will renew your son, ! That is a perfectly crafted bit of incantation. That's exactly how we would form that attributed dialogue under basically any other circumstances. Then he has to face the challenge of severing his own hand in the service of Lord Voldemort. Flesh, of the servant, willingly given, you will, revive, your master. He's faltering, he's hesitant. We use M-dashes in this regard to indicate sharp terminations in thought and in pacing. So this is fragmented and disconnected. Then when we get to Harry, blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, you will, resurrect your foe. An ellipsis and an M-dash are separated by the severity of the cut, I suppose. He's trailing off, blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, you will resurrect your foe. Could be a reading of that last line, right? The ellipses allow that dialogue to flow softer and be less less severed. I was trying to find another word, but you know what? Less severed than the use of the dashes in the previous, yeah. So obviously the bone of his father, representing where Voldemort has come from, flesh of the servant. This is, we are told later, old magic. We are told that this is old dark magic specifically, as distinguished from just old magic. We get two things described as old magic in the course of the next chapter. This is one of them. The other is the means by which Harry's mother saved him back in back during the fall of Lord Voldemort the first time, I suppose. I'm talking around that because, again, we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that in much greater detail when we get there. So the bone of the father, representing where Voldemort has come from and kind of lineage, I suppose. The flesh of the servant, representing his power base, representing, in a sense, his agency, right? You're only going to do this spell if you are deprived of power, and yet Voldemort still has power instantiated in Wormtail at this point. And then blood of the enemy, the purpose for your resurrection, the purpose for your drive, and also the proof of your singular power, even if that power is held in proxy by Wormtail or by some other servant of the Dark Lord at this point. This takes us to the end of what is a very short chapter, chapter 32. Let it have drowned, Harry thought. Let it have gone wrong. And then suddenly the sparks emanating from the cauldron were extinguished. A surge of white steam billowed thickly from the cauldron instead, obliterating everything in front of Harry, so that he couldn't see Wormtail or Cedric or anything but vapor hanging in the air. It's gone wrong, he thought. It's drowned. Please, please, let it be dead. But then, through the mist in front of him, he saw with an icy surge of terror the dark outline of a man, tall and skeletally thin, rising slowly from inside the cauldron. "Robe me," said the high, cold voice from behind the steam, and Wormtail, sobbing and moaning, still cradling his mutilated arm, scrambling to pick up the black robes from the ground, got to his feet, reached up, and pulled them one-handed over his master's head. The thin man stepped out of the cauldron, staring at Harry, and Harry stared back into the face that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. Whiter than a skull, with wide, livid scarlet eyes and a nose that was as flat as a snake's, with slits for nostrils. Lord Voldemort had risen again. And if the transition from the boarding school adventure structure of the Triwizard Tournament into something far darker and something far more immediate was shocking, it is as naught, I suppose, compared to the immediate death of Cedric Diggory, which is as naught compared to the return of Lord Voldemort. Voldemort has, up until this point in the Harry Potter series, acted as that absent antagonist, right? Even when he is present in the first book, he is absent from the first book. It's not really him, it's a shadow of him. And in other children's book series, in other YA series, in other fantasy series, even those intended for adults, the absent antagonist can be a great and constant pressure. Think of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, for example. We never see him. We get maybe one actual attributed action to Sauron in the present of The Lord of the Rings. Maybe one, and only right at the end of the book. But Voldemort has been a shadow. He has been a presence. He has been a foe and a threat, yes, but now his return is shocking. Because we already understand at this point intuitively, because of our osmotic absorption of narrative, we now understand that, oh wait, this is not going to go back the way that it was. Harry is not going to undo this. Harry is not going to somehow cast him back into the shadow. This is it now. This is our new reality. This is our new status quo. So that hard transition out of the Triwizard Tournament, which, as I said, was setting the stage for a conventional end to a Harry Potter novel where, hey, maybe we've learned a thing or two and we've certainly got a little older and we sure played some Quidditch, didn't we? Right? We're not doing that. This is the hardest turn that this book can take and is the turn that the Harry Potter series was always going to hinge upon. It was always going to pivot around this point. You can absolutely, as I've argued before, cut the Harry Potter novel into two halves. You can talk about the pre-Azkaban sections, or you can talk about the pre-Goblet sections, and then the post-Goblet sections. This is the turning point. It is this moment. It is that line. Lord Voldemort had risen again. That is the actual fulcrum around which this entire series revolves. Nothing is going to be the same as we move forward. We're talking about the severing of the hand, and yes, it must be a Weasley saying that the reward of a really cool magical hand is more enticing than the reward of a cool magical finger. Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure that that he knew just how cool his silver hand would be, or what a mixed blessing his cool magical hand would be. But yeah, I think that probably is why Wormtail chose to sever the part of his body that had already been, damaged. He'd already lost that finger. But yeah. Yes, Wilhelm Scream says, at this point, readers take a quick glance at how many pages are left in the book and are left baffled at how in the world this is going to be settled within that time. Wow, we're going to have like a huge battle or something? Is Dumbledore going to show up on the back of Buckbeak and Sirius is going to take his dog form and rush into the... No, that's just not where the story is going. We'll talk about that as we get there. Yeah, good. Excellent, yes. C-Star saying, robe yourself, dude. You have a body now and two hands. That's true. Who has two thumbs and no robe? This guy. Yes, good. Yeah, Sailor Melissa encapsulating it beautifully, actually. Cedric has died, Harry's been through hell, and Voldemort is alive. Not a great Friday. Like not a great day there. Yeah. Good, okay. Let's move into chapter 33, The Death Eaters. We are not going to get through all of this, but we will at least get to the introduction of the Death Eaters. Voldemort looked away from Harry and began examining his own body. His hands were like large, pale spiders. His long white fingers caressed his own chest, his arms, his face. The red eyes, whose pupils were slits like a cat's, gleamed still more brightly through the darkness. He held up his hands and flexed the fingers, his expression rapt and exultant. He took not the slightest notice of Wormtail, who lay twitching and bleeding on the ground, nor of the great snake, which had slithered back into sight and was circling Harry again, hissing. Voldemort slipped one of those unnaturally long-fingered hands into a deep pocket and drew out a wand. He caressed it gently, too, and then he raised it and pointed it at Wormtail, who was lifted off the ground and thrown against the headstone where Harry was tied. He fell to the foot of it and lay there, crumpled up and crying. Voldemort turned his scarlet eyes upon Harry, laughing a high, cold, mirthless laugh. Wormtail's robes were shining with blood now. He had wrapped the stump of his arm in them. "My lord," he choked. "My lord, you did promise." "Hold out your arm," said Voldemort lazily. "Oh, master, thank you, master." He extended the bleeding stump, but Voldemort laughed again. "The other arm, Wormtail." "Master, please, please." Voldemort bent down and pulled out Wormtail's left arm. He forced the sleeve of Wormtail's robes up past his elbow, and Harry saw something upon the skin there, something like a vivid red tattoo, a skull with a snake protruding from its mouth, the image that had appeared in the sky at the Quidditch World Cup, the Dark Mark. Voldemort examined it carefully, ignoring Wormtail's uncontrollable weeping. "It is back," he said softly. They will all have noticed it. And now we shall see. Now we shall know, excuse me. The presence of the dark mark. It has been confirmed. Now, what has been on all these left arms through the course of this book? What does Karkaroff have? What does Snape have? A dark mark. The exact symbol that we saw all the way back at the beginning of the novel. Another symbol which was introduced to us very powerfully early on in the book and kind of fulfilled its narrative purpose. We don't necessarily associate the dark mark with any of the mysteries that are unfolding. The dark mark could just be, as it's presented to us back at the beginning of the book, the symbol of imminent or ongoing depredations by Death Eaters. It doesn't necessarily mean anything more to us than that, except here it is. This is going to be more and more significant as we move forward. We've been talking a lot through the course of this book about othering, about drawing lines between us and them. And I want to talk a little about the ways in which Voldemort is othered, because there is a superficial reading of Voldemort that says that, well, he doesn't look like us. He looks monstrous and is therefore a monster. He is explicitly and more powerfully than any other human character that we meet in Harry Potter, he is inhuman. Mad-Eye Moody is scarred and battered, and Hagrid is a half a giant, and there are other people who don't quite look human, but they are still human. Voldemort is something else, but he is rendered in such monstrous terms that we have no trouble recognizing his evil. So goes the somewhat superficial and facile argument. The point is not that Voldemort looks monstrous and is therefore monstrous. The point is that Voldemort does monstrous things. He takes out his wand, he caresses it gently, then he raises it and points it at Wormtail, who was lifted off the ground and thrown against the headstone where Harry was tied. He fell to the foot of it and lay there crumpled up and crying. Voldemort turned his scarlet eyes upon Harry, laughing a high, cold, mirthless laugh. Why does Voldemort do that? Why does he hurl Wormtail through the air, causing him still more torment and suffering? He's actually right there. Wormtail, who lay twitching and bleeding on the ground, right? So Wormtail is at least as close to Voldemort then as he will be in a moment. Why does he hurl him against the gravestone? Because he's gone all these years without casting a spell. He's gone all these years without exercising his magic. The first thing that he does is take out his wand, and then he demonstrates his power. Not demonstrates, in fact, indulges, also demonstrates, but indulges his power here. He wants to feel that surge again. He wants to be able to, as all wizards can, enact his will upon the world. Enact his will upon the world in a way that is still recognizably supernatural and magical, even to wizards. Even wizards recognize that, God, actually, we probably shouldn't be able to do this. Like, we probably shouldn't. This is a power that man ought not wot of, right? We probably are breaking some kind of underlying rule here in our manipulation of magic. That's what makes it awesome. Voldemort there leaning into that same impulse. And in case we're unsure about Voldemort's cruelty at this point, completely ignoring the whimper. My lord, you did promise. Hold out your arm, offering salvation, offering hope, offering at least a cessation of pain at this point. And Wormtail does so, extending the bleeding stump, and Voldemort laughs again. The other arm, Wormtail. This is so precisely and cleanly and awfully evil that we're left without any space to question our depiction of Voldemort, I suppose, or our... Okay, let me phrase it this way. Voldemort's perceived inhumanity has nothing to do with how he looks. Voldemort's perceived inhumanity, because of the way that this is constructed, is absolutely anchored in his immorality, in his cruelty, in his restless and malevolent evil. And that's not othering. That's not us drawing an arbitrary line between what, well, I suppose, okay, if you're a staunch moral relativist, then maybe you can still argue that this is othering. Well, evil isn't evil and cruelty isn't cruelty. That's just us conforming to our own moral standards and the moral standards of our society. Maybe those things aren't bad to Voldemort. Maybe he's like some bizarro good guy who believes that all of these awful things are actually good things and that he's doing good. Okay, if you are a staunch moral relativist, I apologize. This is probably not the book for you. What anchors Voldemort's inhumanity is not his appearance, it is his action. And we are absolutely encouraged to judge people in their action here. Yeah, let me see. Oh, we're talking about weeping and being fearful of this section during our original reading of the book. Yes, yes. Recycle Up saying, I think I could have handled this at age 8 or 9. Yeah, good. And Jackie saying Voldemort's terrible actions have robbed him of his humanity and his human appearance to an extent. It's like he's visibly a predator now. His looks bring fear. Absolutely, Jackie. Just right on it there. Yeah, good. Good. Okay. Let's talk a little about Voldemort's family. This may be our last slide tonight because I'm afraid I have a hard out tonight. So we'll see what we can do to get through it. Maybe we'll do one more in the arrival of the Death Eaters. You stand, Harry Potter, upon the remains of my late father, he hissed softly. A muggle and a fool very like your dear mother. But they both had their uses, did they not? Your mother died to defend you as a child, and I killed my father, and see how useful he has proved himself in death. Voldemort laughed again. Up and down he paced, looking all around him as he walked, and the snake continued to circle in the grass. You see that house upon the hillside, Potter? My father lived there. My mother, a witch who lived here in this village, fell in love with him, but he abandoned her when she told him what she was. He didn't like magic, my father. He left her and returned to his muggle parents before I was even born, Potter, and she died giving birth to me, leaving me to be raised in a muggle orphanage, but I vowed to find him. I revenged myself upon him, that fool who gave me his name, Tom Riddle. Still he paced, his red eyes darting from grave to grave. Listen to me, reliving family history, he said quietly. Why, I am growing quite sentimental. But look, Harry, my true family returns. The air was suddenly full of the swishing of cloaks. Between graves, behind the yew tree, in every shadowy space, wizards were apparating. All of them were hooded and masked. And one by one they moved forward, slowly, cautiously, as though they could hardly believe their eyes. Voldemort stood in silence, waiting for them. Then one of the Death Eaters fell to his knees, crawled toward Voldemort, and kissed the hem of his black robes. So, a brief accounting of the life of Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle Jr., I guess. Drawing the connection here again, we're just replete with connections between Harry and other characters, right? Harry and Cedric are allied, are aligned, and in another way, in a completely separate way, Harry and Voldemort are aligned. They overlap in their experience. A muggle and a fool, very much like your dear mother, but they both had their uses, did they not? Your mother died to defend you as a child, indicating a functional utility there, right? She died protecting you, so you lived. And I killed my father, and see how useful he has proved himself in death. He, too, has allowed me to live. Our means of interaction were, well, not to jump ahead to what actually happened to Harry, but polar opposite, right? Polar opposite experiences, but the outcome is weirdly reflective, I suppose. You see that house upon the hillside? My father lived there. My mother, a witch who lived here in the village, fell in love with him, but he abandoned her when she told him what she was. He didn't like magic, my father. This is a little heavy on the exposition. Honestly, a little heavy on the exposition, but the quality of the dialogue is such that this mesmerizing and sibilant quality in Voldemort's voice is weirdly compelling. It literally compels. It demands our attention, or at least I find it demanding my attention as I read through these chapters. Yeah. Yeah, Spencer's saying, would Voldemort really have been willing to use his father's house, who he hated? I guess it was convenient to be near the grave. That's actually explicit in the text in just a few slides' time. Yes, they say that obviously we need the bone, so we may as well be here. And if we're going to be here, using the Riddle House actually makes a certain amount of sense. The Riddle House is abandoned, and no one goes there or thinks about it or looks about it or scrutinizes it too hard. The Riddle House also is, in some senses, the last place that you would expect to find Voldemort, and the first place that you would expect to find Voldemort, thus the last place that you would expect to find Voldemort, right? Like, if you're making a list of all the places he could hang out, right at the top of the list might be his old family home, ? And then I feel as though you would immediately scratch that out as being either utterly impossible or far too likely. I think it kind of splits the uprights on that somewhat paradoxically, really rather beautifully, but yes, yeah. Yes, Rahit saying, this exposition, the exposition in this and the following chapters don't bother me because it's so rooted in Voldemort's character. He wants to brag. He's a showman. He wants Harry to be scared to the max before he kills him. He's having fun talking about himself in a depraved way. Yes, I absolutely agree with you, Raheed. I think that that Voldemort is a showman. He is, God, isn't he just the embodiment of everything theatrical that we associate with wizards, right? We've talked before about the theatricality of wizarding culture. That's more true of Voldemort than anything else. And in that sense, he isn't necessarily representative of a particular dark aspect to magic. Voldemort is a dark wizard, but he is also a great wizard. He is the most wizard who also happens to be an evil wizard, right? He is the embodiment of so many qualities that we associate with wizarding, which of course brings us again, which I'm just apparently going to mention every week at this point in our read of Goblet of Fire, that brings us back to the very beginning of Philosopher's Stone, where Minerva McGonagall observes the distinction between Dumbledore and Voldemort, that there are some things that Dumbledore just wouldn't do. They are equally great wizards. They are the most wizardy wizards, right? Both Dumbledore and Voldemort in slightly different ways, yes, but they are both absolutely representative of all that it is to be a wizard, except that Voldemort's evil. So he is great, but evil. Those are separate characteristics. I don't read his theatricality as being a part of anything to do with his evil inclination here or his evil intent. I also, though, not to take anything away from that, in addition to that, I see this as being part of a process that is occurring within Voldemort. Now, I don't think physically, but I think psychologically, he is reintegrating himself into his body, into experience, into the world. You stand upon the remains of my father. So he's talking to Harry here, and it's pretty convivial, actually, right? It's pretty affable as these things go. Then he's looking up, he's looking away. All of this walking up and down he paced, looking all around him as he walked, kind of being in the world and feeling the world and beholding the world again, then turning to the house. You see that house upon the hillside, Potter, telling the story, and then the stop. Listen to me, reliving family history, why I'm growing quite sentimental. It does seem to be as though emotion is ruling Voldemort in this moment, that he is being caught up in old emotions which consciously perhaps he has laid to rest, but which are still urgent and present for him right there. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Must Be a Weasley says his monologue makes it clear what type of villain he is. He's not a dumb one, and he's not like the Joker just doing things for no reason. He's the typical power-hungry, evil to the core classic villain, who monologues. You're absolutely right. Yes, good. All right. Okay, we are actually almost at time. So I think what we'll do is, okay, let's do one more slide. What am I going to do? Just not have the Death Eaters show up? I think we're going to have the Death Eaters show up. Welcome, Death Eaters, said Voldemort quietly. 13 years since we last met. Yet you answer my call as though it were yesterday. We are still united under the dark mark then. Or are we? He put back his terrible face and sniffed, his slit-like nostrils widening. I smell guilt, he said. There is a stench of guilt upon the air. A second shiver ran around the circle as though each member of it longed but did not dare to step back from him. I see you all, whole and healthy, with your powers intact, such prompt appearances. And I ask myself, why did this band of wizards never come to the aid of their master, to whom they swore eternal loyalty? No one spoke. No one moved except Wormtail, who was upon the ground, still sobbing over his bleeding arm. And I answer myself, whispered Voldemort. They must have believed me broken. They thought I was gone. They slipped back among my enemies, and they pleaded innocence and ignorance and bewitchment. And then I ask myself, but how could they have believed I would not rise again? They who knew the steps I took long ago to guard myself against mortal death. They who had seen proofs of the immensity of my power in the times when I was mightier than any wizard living. And I answer myself, perhaps they believed in a still greater power could exist, one that could vanquish even Lord Voldemort. Perhaps they now pay allegiance to another. Perhaps that champion of commoners, of mudbloods and muggles, Albus Dumbledore. At the mention of Dumbledore's name, the members of the circle stirred, and some muttered and shook their heads. Voldemort ignored them. It is a disappointment to me. I confess myself disappointed. It is just magnificent dialogue, is the thing. It is just brilliant dialogue. And I think there is actually a strong argument that if you have ever doubted J.K. Rowling's facility with dialogue, if you've ever doubted her skill in the writing of direct attributed dialogue, Goblet of Fire leaves you basically without a refuge, I think. We had, I think, some genuinely great dialogue pretty early in the series. I think that, of course, Dumbledore and McGonagall, right? I think are established characters. Hagrid's attributed dialogue has always just been great. The Dursleys' attributed dialogue has been awful and odious in exactly the right way. By the time we get to Gilderoy Lockhart, I think she's demonstrating an utter mastery of characterization through attributed dialogue. Then with Lupin and Sirius Black and Prisoner of Azkaban, that's all fantastic. And then in this book, to do Mad Eye Moody, to do Ludo Bagman, who is just chef kiss brilliant on it, like awful, but also chef kiss brilliant on the page. And now this dialogue from Voldemort, it is so distinct. It is so engaging. It is poetic. It is oddly formed and occasionally archaically inclined, which I completely love. It is also, as Ruhit was referencing earlier, staggeringly theatrical. Staggeringly theatrical. He is, step aside, Hugh Jackman, he is the greatest showman, it turns out. It is a disappointment to me. I confess myself disappointed. Why could the Death Eaters have turned against, or how could, I suppose, the Death Eaters have turned against Voldemort? Well, they must have known. They must have believed me broken. They thought I was gone. They slipped back among my enemies. They pleaded innocence and ignorance and bewitchment. Brilliant three-beat there, that repetition. They pleaded innocence and ignorance and bewitchment. That's gorgeously constructed. Then I ask myself, but okay, so logically, why have they not come to find me? Why have they not supported me? Okay, they believed I was destroyed, broken, dead. Okay. How could they possibly believe that? Given that they knew what I had done, given that they knew who I was, that I was the mightiest wizard that has ever been, certainly the mightiest wizard of my age, how could they believe that I was broken? Oh, they've been contaminated. Perhaps they believed a still greater power could exist, one that could vanquish even Lord Voldemort. Perhaps they now pay allegiance to another, that they have, given that they are supplicants, given that they are servants, given that they are submissive in that way, they can't have gone off to create independent lives all their own. No. They've just transferred their loyalty to a greater power, a higher power. Perhaps that champion of commoners, of mudbloods and muggles, Albus Dumbledore. What is by extension of Voldemort's argument, the greater power that Albus Dumbledore commands? Why would, if he's thinking even rhetorically, even performatively about a greater power, even if he's attributing to his Death Eaters a sincerity in this regard, but maintaining a rank insincerity himself regarding Dumbledore's powers, what would potentially the greater power be? Perhaps they believed a still greater power could exist, one that could vanquish even Lord Voldemort. Perhaps they now pay allegiance to another. Perhaps that champion of commoners, of mudbloods and muggles, Albus Dumbledore. Oh, it's exactly that, isn't it? It's that champion of commoners, of mudbloods and muggles, Albus Dumbledore. Commoners is the most interesting one there, so we're going to do that last. Champion of muggles. These people aren't even wizards. How dare you? Champion of mudbloods. Not pure-born wizards, but contaminated, lesser wizards. How awful. Commoners here, not referring to the distinction between muggles and wizards, right? We're going to do that. Mudbloods and muggles, those, so your three types of people, I suppose, from Voldemort's perception here. Pureblood wizards, really great. Mudbloods and muggles, not great. Right? That's the distinction as far as it works out. Yes, there are some people who are capable of casting spells, and maybe they are better than rank muggles. That's, okay, possible, but still there is a distinction there. But commoners? He's leaning here on that notion of natural and manifest British aristocracy, right? Lord Voldemort considers himself noble. He considers, not noble in the virtuous sense, but noble in the aristocratic sense. He considers himself higher than other people. He considers himself more naturally important. His is not an old family or an old name, but he is separating himself out and making a play for aristocracy, which bespeaks a kind of notion of entrenched power structures that are common throughout British social discourse and political discourse, right? This is very tough sometimes for American readers to wrap their heads around, like how deep this goes, how deep the notion of, commoners and gentlefolk, commoners and the nobility, how entrenched that is in the British perception of literally every aspect of British life. Literally every aspect of British life. And of course, here we are in the 21st century, and most people, if you stopped them at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you said, hey, excuse me, I would just like to talk to you about the nobility and the common folk. Would you like to talk about how pressing that is on your life? How often you find yourself observing those distinctions? People are going to say no. People are going to say, actually, that's not a part of my life. It's not a part of British society anymore. The class system has been torn apart. We're all middle class now. We're all embracing this social mobility afforded to the middle class. Okay, like, nice try. But then think about all of the British power structures. Think about every British social and political institution, and you'll see a very different story, in fact. We're going to get into the actual discussion with the Death Eaters themselves next week, I guess, because I am out of time. That is it. That is going to do it. Maybe I can take just a minute to dip into the, question bucket here. Let me cancel this slide and dip in. Catherine asks, if we're right in thinking that the pensive shows memory objectively and without any self-serving bias, wouldn't it be used in the wizarding justice system? Don't get me wrong, I'm an attorney, and in the US it would certainly be unconstitutional to compel the production of memories, but if veritaserum is fine, then using the pensive would be even better. A witness to a crime could simply put the judge and jury at the scene. Sirius Black could prove his innocence. Thoughts? That's a really interesting question, Catherine. Yes, you're right. Obviously, we in the modern world, in the modern Muggle world, would hesitate over the compulsory extraction of memories, I suppose, but the voluntary offering of memories, presumably, therefore, the memories contained within the pensive are not as objective as we may have hoped that they would be. We actually mentioned this a little bit last time. To what degree is Dumbledore's presence within the memory impressed upon the memory? Okay, let me ask you this. If we took two pensives and one contained Dumbledore's recollection of the farcical trial of Ludo Bagman and the other contained Mad-Eye Moody's memories of the farcical trial of Ludo Bagman, would the experience of those memories, if Harry dips his face first in one and then in the other, would he experience the same scene twice, or would he experience different scenes? Because if he experiences different scenes, then it's a wash. Forget it. There is no applicability that we can draw forth from factual applicability that we can draw forth from the pensive, because that aspect of impression, I suppose, is going to render these memories more subjective than they would need to be, I suppose, to pass any kind of factual or objective measure. Is that the case? Maybe. It's an interesting point of speculation, though. But yes, it is. I suppose that I'm more inclined to think that the pensive is simply insufficiently theatrical. Justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. And certainly in the accounts that we've had, whether it's Azkaban or it's Cornelius Fudge or it's Crouch Sr. or it's, the actual memories that we experienced through the pensive, wizarding justice seems to be enormously theatrical. It's not about necessarily determining exactly what happened. It's about that sense of outrage. I do not think that the wizarding world has a just system in place. I do not think that their notion of justice is particularly just or particularly worthy of our respect, I suppose. But the application of the pensive is interesting. I suppose there are other possible alternatives to. Dumbledore does describe it as a pensive, which suggests that it is not the only one, but they could be very rare. They could be very difficult. It is possible that the pensive requires a great deal of training to utilize properly, so that Severus Snape, for example, even if he wanted to surrender his memories of working with Voldemort in order to prove his innocence or relative innocence or whatever, if he wanted to do it, maybe he couldn't. Maybe putting your memories into the pensive is actually a very skillful thing that Dumbledore has learned over the course of many, many years. Maybe... And maybe we might even extend that a step further. This is going to be challenged again later in the series, but maybe we could extend that a step further at this point and say that Dumbledore's skill with the removal of his own memories or the transplantation of his own memories into the pensive is personal, and that he couldn't do that to another individual. Like he couldn't pluck the thoughts from Harry's head and put those in the pensive. We can kind of build a structure around this to account for it. But okay. If we're being, real talk here at 10:35 on a Tuesday evening in Oklahoma City, real talk, you guys, the reason is that J.K. Rowling didn't think of it. The pensive was a great tool in that one scene, but she clearly didn't think through the broader social implications of this magical artifact or the existence of this kind of magical technology, I suppose. That's the main and most obvious and compelling reason, I guess. The second is the idea, for me, the second most compelling argument for me is this idea that Wizarding Justice actually has very little to do with justice. You know, Sirius Black can be locked up without a trial. Ludo Bagman can be let go because he's popular. Barty Crouch's son can be imprisoned on the say-so of people who, even people who are appalled at what happened to the Longbottoms, don't necessarily sanction the testimony that they offered. It's just not just. So that would be my argument, is that we're less concerned with the factual circumstances of the case than we are with seeing emotional justice done. Guys, I'm sorry, this is a hard out. I actually have to stop now. It has been an absolute pleasure talking about tonight's session with you. Let me actually check my notes and tell you what we're going to cover. What we're going to cover next time, of course, is the rest of Chapter 33, The Death Eaters. Yeah, we're not going to make it through 2 chapters next time, but we will cover the rest of the Death Eaters and take a swing at Priori Incantatem 2 and maybe even Veritaserum as well. If we can move pretty swiftly through either of those chapters, that should be a ton of fun. We're going to get a lot more backstory, though, a lot more detail, a lot more possibility, opportunity to speculate and to draw connections, and to certainly draw connections from this event back into previous events in the Harry Potter series, which I can't wait to get to. But that is going to do it for this week. It has been an absolute pleasure. I will see you all. Oh, I didn't even tell you when that was going to happen, did I? That will be at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, Tuesday, May the 22nd, 2018, our usual evening slot next Tuesday evening. I'm looking forward to it already. It's been a pleasure. You guys have a great week. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, mischief managed. Good night, all.